thanks for coming in. I'm Evgeny. I'm leading the tech team at Threads. So we just been having an interesting conversation just now about how good evening sounds, and it depends on the time of the day, it depends on the country you're in, and how it differs between the United Kingdom you're in, France, and Russia, and how it would be appropriate to say good morning at 11:30 in Russia, in England, but wouldn't be appropriate to say the same equivalent of good morning in Russia at 11:30. And it just means that we are very different, we have lots of cultures. When we start coding, we do get much closer to each other. We start speaking similar languages, but we do have a very multicultural team here at Threads, and we can see when people just join and they come from Russia, there is a lot of adjustment, and culture is closer, but it's still very different. So how people do software in Russia very much differs from how people do software in the UK, and it's very different from how people do it elsewhere. And even though it wasn't the motivation for us, I do believe that open source makes us all better engineers. And I actually did some impromptu speech at the conference about why we should do it. And so I think that when you do open source, your language gets even closer than just software in general, because a lot of people collaborate on projects. They come from all over the world, and they have to agree with each other. They have to share the culture. They have to share the principles, and that brings people much closer together. Gajus, I worked with Gajus in the past a little bit. It was a very good experience. Interesting. And some of my open source success I didn't blame on this man. He was very kind to come to this. This is actually the first event we're doing for this group, so this is still a small group. And Gajus, I think, is extremely prolific, extremely successful open source contributor, and unlike me, he knows what he's doing in open source. So.
Alright. Well, that concludes the talk.
That's me. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you again. So, yeah. Other than what the meetup title said, I'm going to talk about my experience developing in open source and what I've learned from what's just over 200 projects or so that I'm proud of, and some of the learning experiments along the way. Oops. It was working a minute ago. Let's see. I know, right? That's okay. We can switch to manual. I know this sounds like, are we going to go through all the basics? But I think it contains some interesting observations. What is open source in general? And there are two conditions that are broadly agreed by everyone, and the third is something that I've added because I think you cannot have something called open source if you do not incorporate that. So the first one is the most obvious. It has to be a publicly available code that anyone can access. Second one, again, license permits to study, change, and distribute the software. And the third one is that contributions to the code base have to be accepted from third parties, so users and so forth. Interestingly enough, even though all of these look like very basic requirements, they've been abused and used in different ways throughout the lifetime of open source. Starting with the first one, publicly available source code. You'd think there's very few things you could do to mess this one up, right? But in the days where open source was sort of on the first wave of becoming accepted as a way of attracting talent to companies, it's been abused a lot. And one of the famous examples of this is NVIDIA, the company that produces video cards. Those guys saw it as an opportunity. Well, a lot of people and companies and media are talking about open source, and if we do open source, we're going to attract talent. But they had a problem. They didn't want to disclose. They didn't want to disclose how they interact with the hardware, how their drivers interacting with the hardware. They wanted to obfuscate that. So given this definition and the licensing requirements, what they've done is they've released the code that is sufficient to compile the code into the binaries that are used for the drivers, but they obfuscated the code. So you couldn't read it as a human being. You would basically see a minimized code and so forth. So these are the dark patterns that exist throughout the history of open source and that we're going to see quite a few companies engage in. License permits to study, change, and distribute the software. This is an interesting one. I couldn't find many popular open source projects that actually fully adheres to this licensing condition. These days, we see mostly a lot of the software that's distributed either as dual licensed or with exceptions restricting certain use environments. So source available rather than open source. Some famous examples of that would be Redis. Everyone perceives Redis to be an open source product that's used everywhere, but very recently, multiple times, the license was changed to say Redis source available. And this was designed with a good intention, although it backfired. And the intention was to prevent large companies such as Amazon, Alibaba Cloud, and Google from integrating Redis into their services and reselling it as their own product. Good intention, but effectively it makes it not adhere to the original definition of open source. And the third one is, well, you can't really have an open source product or claim it to be open source if you do not accept contributions from the community and you do not admit them into the cycle of planning what the product is going to be. Some examples of that you may be familiar with is MySQL at the days of when Oracle acquired MySQL. When Oracle acquired MySQL, one of the big red flags for everyone was that the issue board that allowed users to see what are the security concerns reported was shut down. You couldn't see what's bad being reported about the software, which is probably the only time in my career where it was a major red flag, and I was like, okay, switching to Postgres tomorrow. So I started rewriting everything. It was a good choice. I'm really happy about it. Flow, Facebook Flow is a good example of something that's recently definitely suffered from this. They're open source project that will accept contributions from everyone, but the planning, the roadmap, and the general architecture is never discussed with the public. It's happening entirely behind closed doors. And this is partly why we're seeing something like TypeScript gaining so much momentum. Unlike Flow, it's written in TypeScript itself. So TypeScript is actually written in TypeScript itself, interestingly. And it works in Windows machines, and it accepts third-party contributions into the roadmap, into the development roadmap. So that is open source. And then the next question, logically, is why would someone do open source? I think it's obvious to all of us what we as consumers get from open source, and it's sometimes easy to forget that. If you go 10, 20 years back, there weren't that many options for you software-wise when you were starting an IT business. The software was either commercial or it was some tiny projects, isolated use cases, very niche and so forth. Things like programming languages, they were proprietary. Java, Wolfram, MATLAB, quite a few examples of proprietary languages that eventually developed into either fully open source languages or partially open source. Java to this day is, interestingly enough, they maintain patents on certain parts of the language, like the distributed binaries. If you're familiar, I believe it was 2007 that, I believe so, don't quote me on this one, that, was it Oracle? Oh my god, I'm blubbering. that Google was sued, basically. And they lost the case, by the way. So Google was sued for the fact of using Java, for using the embedded libraries, the binary libraries on mobile devices. And is it Oracle, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oracle versus Google over Android, basically.
Exactly, yeah. So Oracle versus Google over Android. And they lost the case. What they're going to pay out is still to be seen, but the claim was $8.8 billion, which is a lot of money. Similar goes for databases at a time. Again, if you look 10, 20 years back, Oracle was basically the choice for any enterprise, and to this day it maintains to be the software choice for all the enterprises, and so forth. So it's easy to forget how it was before, and it has some interesting implications. So I mentioned programming languages being proprietary. Part of the reason why open source picked up steam was because the proprietary languages, those like, let's say, Visual Basic script, were starting to dominate the market. So someone like Microsoft effectively started to become a dominant language in the market and controlling where the language can be deployed, which created big problems for a new entrant in the market, basically saying that I cannot compete with you unless we have a fair playing ground where I can develop anything I want with the most commonly used language. So that's why a lot of the companies started investing, especially Google, in open source, making everything in a way that pushes away monopolies out of the playing field. So, but as an open source developers, we individuals, this is the most common question that I get asked. Like why would I do open source? And so I'm a startup founder, multiple startup founders, and indie hacker, whatever you call me, the guy who constantly creates something and pushes it out. And if you've done anything like that, staying cost efficient and lean is one of the key things you want to do. So cost saving is the first and the most obvious thing that you achieve with open source. If you're releasing open source or source available, regardless of the license code, you get to leverage a lot of benefits, such as Travis, GitHub, and so forth. So from the first day zero, when you're starting to create anything, you have pretty much zero cost apart from your own time attached to what you're releasing. And for a lot of people, this is a big enough incentive to start working in open source. Feedback medium. This was something why I'd say I've started working in open source a lot. Back in the days when I would have I still have every single day tons of questions, but when you had these questions that you couldn't really extract what you want to ask because everything is broken in your code, there wasn't an easy way to share with the community what you're asking about. Stack Overflow didn't exist to a large extent, so what you needed was a repository, structured code, where you could create an isolated code sample and documentation and share it with the community who knows their stuff, leave it there, and collect the feedback over time. Open source provides you to that. You have GitLab, GitHub, and other. So which brings us to community. The biggest value from open source, if you're a developer in open source, is community. I'm curious, how many of you know of Freenode?
The IRC one.
Yes.
Well,
Is it just to Evgeny?
Well, it was one thing.
Well, so if I had to name one thing that had the biggest influence in my life as a developer, that improved me, and to this day, I still use it for the last 9, 10, 12 years, but it was every single day, it's Freenode. Now, Freenode is an internet relay chat. It's equivalent of the modern Slack. let's put it that way. It's been created in this specific community has been created in '94, so it's really old. It has about 90,000 users and etc. And that's what makes it unique. The people who are there, they've been there for 10, 20 years. They're the wolves of the industry. They're the people who started their own companies. They're the people who are basically spending their days helping others to get into the source, into coding. And the primary topic on Freenode is open source. If either you're using open source or you're developing open source. In other words, anytime I had any question about any repository, library, whether I'm learning MySQL or whether I'm learning PHP, this is the community that I want to ask questions. And the cool thing about it is, if you want more advertising in Freenode, is that pretty much any project you're going to pick, MySQL, Postgres, whatever, you are going to find either the founder of that software original or the founding team members of that software on those channels chatting with you actively. So pretty much the stuff that I'm learning, even to this day, is directly from the people who actively contribute to the source codes of all of these popular projects, whether it's Java, PostgreSQL, or etc. It's a really valuable asset. And it's been a big part of why I'm actively remain in open source community. So those are the short-term benefits that you get from the first day when you start open source. And obviously then there are very different set of long-term benefits. One, and the one that I think that has increased my value the most as a developer and the person, is self-discipline. If you're making something public, you're becoming accountable of it, and you don't want to be really a laughing stock for what you publish. So you start to think very carefully about every single line of code that you publish, about security implications of every code that you publish, and most importantly, I think, is the rule of three, which basically states that for anything to be generally useful outside of a very small niche use case, it has to at least satisfy needs of 3 different businesses or within 3 different business fields that have similar requirements without sharing the codes that are business specific in between them. which basically means that as opposed to when you're developing something, because Evgeny told you to, create me this queue for processing incoming requests or something, your mindset is not, I'm creating this for this specific company, but your mindset is, well, if this company had this requirement and another team had this requirement, how would I design this API to make it universally acceptable for everyone? And interestingly enough, this is one of the biggest benefits that a company itself has if it encourages open source. Because if you promote self-discipline of developers and you make them accountable not only within your team, but also to the public, you're encouraging a culture within your development team that is always accountable to the public. And that's always working to create something that's more useful than just for that specific small niche case that's being spec'd out in the project requirements. Talent acquisition, career. I think these are to a large extent self-explanatory. Talent acquisition, if you are a large company, having open source work shows that you're committed to quality code, you're committed to attracting the best talent. People who explore your open source repositories, they can see who are contributing to them and so forth. And it's an easy way, by the way, if you're looking to become part of some company, it's one of the best ways to get feedback about what's the development culture in the company is to go to GitHub and ask the developers there, because those are the people you're going to be working with. Career, if you're an open source developer, there's nothing better than your GitHub repository when you're applying for jobs. Like, no CV on earth is going to outdo you than your GitHub repository. I've personally benefited from this a lot in my life. I pretty much never interview. Whenever I go to the job, it's basically saying, we saw your GitHub repository, it's amazing, how much do you want? Which is a really nice conversation to have because you don't need to stress about it. Which brings us to commercial open source. A lot of conversations that I'm seeing reoccurring on social media, especially in the last couple of years, is about, well, how do I make money from open source? Which bothers me because there are so many benefits even before you get to the money about open source. Well, the first and the most obvious is donations. This is something that we've seen on a lot of repositories. GitHub recently added functionality where they're going to double down on any donations that you get as a developer. Being frank with you, I've interviewed a lot of people on the subject. There is a very tiny amount of people who are getting any money directly from donations. You're not going to earn a good living from this. Even one of the top 5 guys in open source, based on the volume that he produced, the guy's earning $3,000 a month, which is not, it's not a lot of money. Dual licensing, which is basically you're developing some core product that everyone is happy with, and you're offering additional features on top of it, or you are restricting the use on certain platforms, such as in the case of Redis. This is a fine approach, but this is something that you're unlikely to go from the day zero. You need to build a community first around. You need to attract users with a value proposition that's already valuable to them and can be integrated in their business. And then if you identify certain use cases for your software that you think would be worthy additions for a premium price, this is something that you upgrade to. Some recent examples of that is TimescaleDB, if any of you are familiar. It's an extension for Postgres, which enables time series database partitioning in PostgreSQL. And they recently introduced this dual licensing model, which basically enables additional materialization and running averages in commercial version of the model of the license. Professional services is effectively you offering consulting and support to companies who are wanting to use your open source product. This, I've heard evidence that works for some really well. You can get patron companies who effectively will commit a certain amount of money monthly for you to provide support for X amount of hours, which can range for 200, 500, thousands, and so forth. So this one is where I see a lot of developers making money from their projects. Software as a service, package binary. This is one of the ones that I like the most, which is basically I'm developing something really awesome and anyone can use it, but you're probably too lazy to deploy it or you don't want to look after it. Just use mine one instead. And the benefit of that is the users feel more confident about what they're using because they can look in the source code and understand how you're managing security, how you're managing their data, and so forth. So this is pretty neat. I think all of you have run into at least one repository where they say that this is free open source, but if you want the package binary for Windows or Mac OS, you're going to pay like whatever $12, something like that. It's a nice model. Bounties, which is basically you being overwhelmed with the amount of issues that people are raising on your repositories and saying, I'm going to do this thing, but I'm, pay me 50 at least. I need some beer money on this one. And advertising, something that has been mentioned recently. And how many of you are familiar with the recent, what do you call it, incident? Where
Yeah, we all are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm talking about the Ferris, where he tried to integrate into CLI, into npm install logs, a message saying that, hey, why don't you, if you're using this software, you're also going to see these ads into your install logs. It's an interesting attempt at commercialization. Interestingly enough, some companies, bigger companies, have been more successful at this. Mozilla is a good example of that. Mozilla makes a fairly substantial amount of money from donations, obviously, but also from selling merchandise and being associated with certain events which they consider to be sponsorship and advertising deals. So it's not impossible. Contributing to open source. This is once in a while I'm going to get an email which basically says something along the lines of, "Thank you for all the contributions that you've done. How can I start doing my own open source contributions?" I find it funny because it's not a trendy thing. Oh yeah, he's doing it. Let's all join in and let's do this open source thing. No, it's open source. At least for me and for everyone that I know, has been a very. It became a necessity effectively. You had a problem. You used something. You had a problem with that software. You raised an issue and you offered a solution and you created a pull request and you collaborated with the developer to merge it in. There's not much to say about this one. I'm just surprised that people are asking about it. But if I can give one advice about it, is just pick something that will applies to you yourself. Don't chase after. I've seen the reason I'm saying this is because there's these growing communities and dashboards and where people are advertising, I need help with this, I need help with that, and there's a bunch of people who want to add to their CV the fact that I've helped that project, I've contributed documentation to that project, and so forth. I don't think this is good because contribution is something most valuable from people who have the shared issue, who understand the problem they're solving, and who are going to commit in the long term to support the project. So just a personal advice on this. Starting a project is another thing that I always get asked. Well, okay, I'm not going to contribute, but how do I start a project? And I was thinking, I looked at my repositories and I looked at what made me start each and every project. And I found some interesting things that I didn't expect. So the low ball, the hanging, I'm by the way opportunist. So whenever I see opportunities to start an open source project, I go for it. Because it drives me the fact that I own this new share of land where people are coming and contributing in the open source space. So one of those was ESLint deprecating JS-doc. So for ESLint is a linting software in JavaScript. You're all JavaScript, I forgot, yeah. So ESLint had a subset of rules that were dedicated to JS-doc, and at one point they announced they were deprecating them. And I saw this notice of deprecation, and the first thing I had done is create ESLint plugin JS-doc, copy over all the rules from there, and start adding new rules, and so et cetera, et cetera. The brilliant thing about it is that, unlike with many other open source projects, you instantly get community, like overnight. All the people who've been using previously ESLint are going to jump and try to help you and contribute the incompatibilities between the projects and so forth. ESLint plugin to this day is one of the most active projects I own in the sense of how many contributors it has that are actively driving the project forward without me being very actively involved. Interestingly enough, most of them are Chinese. Or from Asia. Duplicate code is where my majority of the code, my majority of the open source repositories arrive. It's basically me every day solving some task in my business and copy pasting one snippet of code from one library to the other library, from one repository to the other repository, and so forth. This is a clear indication for me that either I'm reinventing the wheel or this should be abstracted in some third-party module that is likely going to help someone to solve a similar problem. The reason I like about it, again, is because it forces me to think about how to make this more reusable, how to make it documented, and likely if I didn't have tests before, I'm going to write a test if I'm publishing it. So it comes down to, again, accountability once you present something to the public. Rapidly growing communities. This is an example where, again, you're actively chasing to be at the forefront, and you want to lead some technology. A good example of that was when React was growing fast. He had this insane adoption rate. People chasing for the nicest abstraction to work with DOM after jQuery and so forth. And one of the first problems that the community faced was, well, how do we do styling of this? Because we've never done it before. And CSS modules emerged as one of the dominating patterns in general in JavaScript at the time. And in this case, the opportunity was, well, I see that something is always solving in JavaScript the problem for styling, but it's not necessarily something that will feel native to React. If I bridge the gap, it's a very tiny contribution between these two problems. I'm going to capture a substantial share of that community. And it happened. Overnight, it became one of the, I think it's to this day, the fastest growing projects that I've ever had, reaching 10,000 stars in GitHub, like basically over a couple of weeks. And then on top of that, using that velocity, spin up another project called Babel plugin React CSS module, which again, like boosted up and grow fast. So I think, in general, if the reason I emphasized in the previous slide, do something that drives you, is because it's two things. It's the fact that you're enjoying to solve the problem. It solves a problem that you actually had. I actually had a problem of how do I style it in a native way. And it also has a positive reinforcement from a community that what you're doing is right. You feel nice about people using it, and they send you compliments and whatnot. Niche interest is something that's harder, especially if you're a novice. Is that how you say it? I think novice. If you're a novice in programming, so if it basically requires you to have some very niche interest in some very particular problem that pretty much no one cares about. It's your opportunity to show off and say that I can solve this better than anyone. Ironically, this is the only bullet point on this slide that is the riskiest one to share to do in open source. And the primary reason for that is that if you have very niche problem to solve, especially if I'm talking about you as a business, it's likely that your competitors are going to benefit from you solving and publishing this the most as well. In my case, this was Surgeon, which is a declarative DOM extraction engine, which basically means that without writing any code but writing instructions, you can extract information from documents like HTML or whatever it would be. Expertise. It's something that's not niche, that applies to a lot of people, but you think I can do better than anyone else because I've spent so much time working with this. Again, not something easy for a novice to pick up, but it's something that's, I think, most rewarding if you're successful at this. I had so many attempts that failed and flopped because community does not accept, mature community, it's really hard to force mature community to migrate to a new project. Put it simple, they're more likely to adopt the best features out of your product and integrate into the existing projects than to move into a new project. In my case, it's working fairly smoothly. Slotting is a new project for me. It's a Postgres client, but it's the fastest growing Postgres client in the Node.js ecosystem. Just neat. If you're doing anything in Postgres, grab Slotting. This is where we get into some of the embarrassing stuff and spam and parsers. I think Evgeny wanted me to talk in this in this presentation the most. So once you have your open source project published, well, your ultimate goal is to have people use it, and to have people use it, and to have people contribute to it. And it's fairly easy to get users on board, but you should always start with, or at least I always start by getting contributors on board. And there are multiple reasons for that. One, you get to learn from existing contributors of similar problems, how they've solved this, or why they weren't successful at solving it, or why they gave up on their solutions, and so forth. So the first thing that I do whenever I release anything is I go very directly, find emails of every owner of the previous repositories, and email them up and say, hey, I'm actually creating a competitor to what you've been doing, and I've learned a lot by reading your documentation. Would you mind checking out what I'm doing and help me improve this, and maybe you want to merge into doing this together? A lot of people don't reply to that, surprisingly. But those who do have become the most loyal contributors to the projects that I do. And in some cases, I've joined their projects because they made good reasons for doing that. In other cases, they either handed over the projects to me. I recently took over Flow runtime, or they actively contributed to how I'm developing that project. It's a lot easier when you're not doing it together because of the rule of free. Other people will have inputs from their previous experience explaining why some things, some nice APIs fell short that you think at the time. Fast feedback loop is something that I get compliments about. And I think it's one of the most important things if you're an owner of an open source repository. One of the problems that I survey quite regularly people about open source now, because I want to start a business related to open source, which was supposed to be the topic of this presentation. And one of the reasons that I get for people not liking to contribute to open source is that even if I contribute something now, today, I'm not going to get feedback instantly. I'm going to wait for a week or so. It's probably not going to get merged. I'm going to get a lot of pushbacks and so forth. In other words, people just want to get shit done. They don't want to wait for you to 2 weeks to decide, is that a feature that you want to be merged? So you can reply no instantly, which is fine. Just give arguments why, but do it fast. And once you do accept their contributions, you say, fine, do work on that, or help me to develop it. Merge it fast and release it. I cannot emphasize how much more satisfying it is when you contribute to something that instantly gets released. There are so many projects that if you go on their website, on their GitHub repositories, you're going to find PRs hanging for 7 months, for a year, for 2 years. Those are dead. Those developers are not going to come back to your project, or at least definitely not going to come back to work on that issue because they've solved it a long time ago. They probably released a competing package and so forth. And the final one is, ironically, it's a chicken and egg problem, but if you want to attract contributors, you have to have a user base. Luckily, that's not a hard bit, at least I think so. Attracting users is fairly easy, and it's something that I start from day zero. By asking questions, on Freenode, on Stack Overflow, etc. I spam a lot of people. If I'm developing something, I'm going to mention my repository 5 times in the same question. Like Slotting is doing this really well, but Slotting is facing that problem of the concurrency. And I was wondering if you can advise on Slotting. And then eventually someone will interrupt me and say, what is Slotting? And then well, glad you asked. What made you ask? So asking questions in the community, and not only on forums, but also on the competing repository issue thread. You're saying so you're going to find, if you're going to a competing repository, a substitute project, maybe not a competing repository, you're going to find a bunch of unanswered issues. You go to those issues, and those are your opportunities to improve on something. Those are your opportunities to go and say to that person, actually, I have the same issue, and that's why I started this project. Why don't you help me to solve it together? I never really had a backfire from this one. So I never had, say, a repository owner come back to me and say, like, don't advertise your project here, because your intention is good, and as long as you package it in a way that your intention is good, everyone's winning from this. Contact public persons. Once I develop anything, one of the first things that I try to do, I try to find people around that are authorities on Twitter and so forth, and I ask them, hey, look what I developed. I think it solves a problem that a lot of your followers will find interesting. Developers don't do that. It's such a simple way of getting attention to your project. If you take a React, you have someone like Dan. Dan's DMs are open, I think, and you say, Dan, look at this stuff that I made. Pretty cool, huh? You don't say, like, hey, can you share it for me? But if he likes it, he shares it. And you have this, conversion rate. But if you, like me, message 50 or 60 people, some of them will do it. and that will generate enough attention for the word to start spreading on social media. Social media, specifically Reddit, I think a lot of you are going to be using Reddit in one form or another, is where I see most of the contra arguments for the things that I'm developing being raised. So no one's going to come and give a shit about your project on your GitHub repository. But if you post it on Reddit, you're going to get some hard critique, and which is nice sometimes because it makes you realize that, oh, actually, there's there's some shortcomings to either my code or the way I present my code. And it's a lot more often to the way I present my code as opposed to the code itself, which I'm going to talk in a second. Writing articles is an obvious one. If you release something and you want people to adopt, you need to go to extensive links to explain why it's how it's solving their problem. There are tons of repositories that I've written that are probably under 200 lines of code, something like that. But I've written long articles just explaining why this small API makes sense and you don't need like really, really complex logging platform or something like that. And articles work because articles is, interestingly enough, something that gets picked up the first thing when people search for solutions to their problems. So if someone were to search on Google at the moment, what is the best JSON logger for Node.js, I think one of my the first couple of results are going to be my articles because I've said the best JSON logger in Node.js is, and then I go to explain what it is. Participate on issues, I mentioned that. Contributed PRs is an interesting one. And Evgeny said that I've helped him getting one of his projects off the ground. And this was me basically going to some of the popular open source projects such as ESLint, Webpack, and raising a PR that integrated Evgeny's project, basically saying this solves the problem a lot better than anything that you guys been using before. This is the validation. This is so forth. If I just raise an issue, just let's replace that thing. I don't think it's likely that anyone from that repository would have put in an extra effort to go that mile and integrate a new project. Just like it's working already, why would I take that extra step? But if you raise an issue, discuss why you want to do it, and offer the help of raising the PR and doing the test coverage and so forth, people are going to say yes to it if it's worth it, and the presumption here it is. Which takes us to the last, and Evgeny's HTTP library is amazing, but I'm sure you all know that is. Which takes me to the last point, and that's make good first impression. It's one thing for people to see your project on Twitter, and it's one thing for them to see on Reddit and so forth, but really the trigger is once they see the documentation. The interesting thing about this is that if you look at your analytics of your projects, the volume of people who just check the documentation versus people who actually dig in a code, there's a tiny amount of people who actually look in the code. You could get away with empty files, I guarantee you. As long as you write a really nice documentation, for a long time, you would get away with just good documentation. And this is something that, again, working in open source is going to make you better at over time. So coming up with a good name. Bad news for you are that a lot of the short names that are going to come up are going to be taken because NPM is so vast. So the first cringy thing that I can tell you about it is that every week I send at least 2 free emails to NPM support, carbon copying the owner of the repository and saying, hey dude, I see that you're owner of this NPM table package that hasn't been updated for 2 years. Would you mind if I take it over to release this package? And the good thing is that most of these accounts turn out to be idle, and NPM support takes 2 weeks or so to overturn them to you, and you get the package name. So don't use it for anything malicious. But it allows you to get nice names, even if you're a latecomer. A lot of the packages that I have are with short names are because of this simple trick. Simple description, it's such an elementary thing, but when you go to all these repositories, they try to make it sound complex, like a problem that they solve in a unique way that it's esoteric and out of this world. People just want to know if it's going to work for their use case. That's literally all they want to know, like what standards it supports and what platform it works on, and that's it. After that, you can drive in and start explaining your motivation for doing it. I think motivation is very important. Once you have, let's say, 10, I don't know how many libraries there are for logging in Node.js ecosystem. I'm guessing probably hundreds. But that's why the first thing that I've written on Roar library was a very long motivation paragraph explaining how is it different from any previous attempt, why you should use it, what benefit it has in the long term to you and the community, and so forth. And people like that. People people notice it. Obviously there's a balance between like how much you can write before people just give up on reading it and go like, yeah, it's probably too much for this week and I'll just bookmark it. But people do come back and say, it's nice that you included motivation because it allows me to understand how to use it, which then you go to use it, recipes, and explaining, what makes yours different from the other, a simple table. The reason why I see a lot of people not include this one is very cringy because the difference is so small that they don't want to mention this. It's simple as that. And if you're being dishonest to yourself and you're just hiding this because the difference is so small, then just don't do it. Contribute it to the original library. You're probably going to win more from that. And integration with the third parties. iCandy, forgot that one. That's an important one. It's such a simple thing to do, but if you add like a moving picture or something that shows your program in progress, it's something that will attract people's attention among all the other repositories that you've seen that day. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, that summarizes all the tricks in my general experience, motivations and inspirations and growth hacks and open source. So thank you very much. If you have any questions. Any questions, anyone?
For me, there was like GitSpo in the title.
Yeah, where did you find that? Sure, I'll mention about GitSpo. I think I talked a lot about the positive feedback loops, and this is the reason I've started GitSpo. And GitSpo, I'll open it because it's such a colorful picture. I'm still giving away these shirts if anyone wants to. Just drop me a message. Let's click on any of these guys. So what it does is it's very simple concept. Anytime you release anything on GitHub, you want to know about it because if people are using it, it's going to make you feel good about what you're doing. And what GitSpo does is it actively scans entire GitHub. It scans entire NPM, scans entire Stack Overflow, Reddit, some Facebook channels, Slack channels, Freenode, and so forth, many of these sources. It tracks any mentions of GitHub, NPM, and other package registries, and it informs developers whenever someone is talking about their projects. So you constantly get this nice feedback loop about when people are talking about it. The greatest surprise about this thing is that obviously you have some very loyal users in open source who are using it actively. But the nice thing is people who never knew that someone is talking about their project. The first timers who released something in the past and then came here and looked at their mentions and they found that a lot of people were talking about it and had issues described in relation to your product. And those are the opportunities for you as a developer to attract loyal contributors and users to your project. If you see someone talking and discussing the benefits between A and B, you can jump in the conversation and say, hey, author of Slonic here, or whatever, and I'm going to help you answering all the questions. Come join the community and raise any issues and suggestions. That's GitSpo. Coming next summer. In full view. Okay, thank you.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
When do you have time to maintain all of the things that you have built and respond to issues and check pull requests and so on? Because each time you start a new project, you're taking more overhead, which is going to last, and aren't you afraid that it will accumulate and take all your time?
It's an interesting question, one that I was thinking today when I mentioned to a friend that I'm going to this presentation, I'm going to give this talk, and I said, what are you going to talk about? Well, I developed this a couple of hundred projects, and he goes, a couple of hundred? How about all the legacy that's chasing you in the night? And the truth is that this is where the accountability, and this is where I mentioned that it allows self-discipline to be developed over time, in a sense that I've just learned to structure code in a way that enables easy outsider contributions into my project. I've automated a lot of the release cycles. So if someone is raising PR, the code coverage, the tests, the styles are automatically checked, obviously, and the release, once the PR is managed, is automatically done as well. Using CI/CD pipeline. So in other words, as long as the contributions are coming from the third party, the entire release cycle doesn't take me a couple of minutes of my personal attention. That's the ideal situation where you want to be. But it's true. The more repositories you have over time, that accumulates and starts chasing you at nighttime with notifications. And the truth is that, yeah, I do spend a significant amount of time on open source, but that's because there's rarely a reason not to do it in open source. Even if I'm solving problems for my own business, I usually try to do it in open source because it enables all those benefits I mentioned before about accountability, feedback, and so forth. When I'm negotiating contracts with companies that ask me, hey, can you come work on this project? I also require in my contract that I'm going to be allowed to do certain part of my work in open source as a part of that commitment to that company. So, yeah. So.
But doesn't it make you depressed if you see like 200 issues all waiting for your attention?
To be fair, there are quite a lot of people who are helping me. I definitely cannot take a credit for closing all 200 of those issues. There's only 2 or 3 projects that I've closed because of that reason, simply because I couldn't cope with the demand and it wasn't any longer an issue that addressed me, was of relevance to me, and I couldn't find a person to hand it over. There's more and more initiatives at the moment exactly for these scenarios where people are getting into open source groups where they all share permissions and access to the code base in order to help to support each other to look after the community once the developer loses interest in the open source project. Yeah. Cool.
Thanks. Oh, you want to be? What did you ask? No.
Is this crashing?
Just
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.